On February 14th, 2015, in the West Midlands city of Birmingham, 15,000 Muslims gathered to mourn and celebrate one of the unheralded giants of Islam in 20th and 21st century Britain. Muhammad Abdullah Khan, known to many as Sufi Abdullah or Sufi Sahib, had passed away 2 days before, following a prolonged illness, at the age of 92. He was buried in a plot adjacent to the grand mosque that had been built under his leadership. For 52 years, Sufi Abdullah dedicated his life to the worship and remembrance of God and to the service of both his homeland in Pakistan and his adopted community in England. His powerful presence, intense spirituality, and his relentless and disciplined dedication to restoring the faith and practice of immigrant working-class Muslims in England's second city and across the Midlands and the United Kingdom is an inspiration for community builders and a luminous example for those who aspire to tread the spiritual path. From the moment he landed in Birmingham in 1962, Sufi Abdullah was on a mission. He had been charged by his spiritual master to emigrate from his native Pakistan and bring a spiritual path to the thousands of Pakistani immigrants who had come to England for material gain, but who were losing their faith and religion in the process. The 39-year-old retired soldier of humble origins left his family and everything he'd known and started a new life in a foreign land purely for the sake of God and his messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Whereas his compatriots had immigrated to Britain to make money, Sufi Abdullah had come to rescue them from a life without meaning. By the time he returned to visit his homeland in the Punjab 7 years later, wearing the same blue suit he'd worn the first time he arrived in England, he had single-handedly, by the force of his personality and against all odds, established a vibrant spiritual path and laid the foundations for a strong, orthodox, and spiritually oriented Muslim community in the industrial heartland of Britain. His remarkable tale begins in an impoverished peasant village, moves to the battlefields of North Africa, a Nazi prison camp in Germany, a farm in France where he hid out after a daring cross-country escape, and a life-changing encounter in an army barracks with a living spiritual master. With the partition of India and creation of Pakistan, the young veteran joined the Pakistan Army and served with distinction for the next 14 years. It was only then, in middle age, that the real adventure began. I can't remember exactly when or where I first laid eyes on Sufi Abdullah. It was probably in about 1975 and most certainly in London. What I do remember is that he was not like anyone I had ever seen before. To begin with, he was tall. He seemed to tower over his companions. But his height was only part of the picture. He radiated energy. He walked with this vigorous swagger, full of intention. Even more striking was a radiant, almost playful smile he would occasionally flash, which in no way diminished his innate gravitas. I spent one night with him, which I recounted in Signs on the Horizons. We gathered at a modest brick row house in a working-class neighborhood in London after sunset. We had tea and talked casually until the night prayer, after which a delicious Pakistani supper was served on tablecloths spread across the floor of the room we had gathered in. For us, a meal after the night prayer usually signaled the end of an evening. These men, I discovered, were just getting started. A large circle was formed, and the invocation began. Sufi Abdullah led the assembly with single-minded intensity. The practice began slowly and accelerated gradually in unison until the group breathed as a single body, lost in the remembrance of God. Time passed. We were swept away in this luminous circular breath. Time flowed. The invocation ended. It was dawn. We prayed the dawn prayer, and the assembly broke up. I staggered out into the early morning air, ready to collapse. Sufi Abdullah walked out with me. On the working-class street, he looked down at me with a twinkle in his eye and a chuckle and gave me a pat on the back with his large hand as if to say, "Nice try." He shook my hand with an iron grip. Unruffled, he was ready to head back to Birmingham. After that encounter in the mid-1970s, I had no contact with Sufi Abdullah until the early 1990s, when Peter Sanders and I traveled to Birmingham to join the annual Eid procession through the streets of the city that he had established and led in 1973, and which had since become a cultural institution. By this time, construction was underway on Sufi Abdullah's crowning achievement, Central Jamia Masjid Ramkhul Sharif, which was to become the largest mosque in Britain. We followed the procession to the end at the Dar al-Ulum Community Center, in hopes that Peter could take Sufi Abdullah's portrait and I could conduct an interview. But by this time, he had become a public figure with a large following, and we were unable to breach the phalanx of community leaders, deputies, and devotees crowding into the Dar al-Ulum Center. The last time I saw Sufi Abdullah was in 2013, on a visit to Birmingham to promote Signs on the Horizons. My hosts asked if there was anything I wanted to do or see. I told them that the only thing I wanted to do was to see Sufi Abdullah. So I was taken to his house on 38 Warwick Road, where I met Sufi Javid Akhtar, Sufi Abdullah's son, and his grandson, Junaid. They led me through the large public area which had been used as a mosque to a small back room that had been Sufi Abdullah's domicile since 1975. It was a poignant encounter. This great man of God, once robust and bursting with energy, was now 90 years old and in failing health. The scene was bleak. Here was this frail old man with sad eyes, sitting alone in a plain room in an empty house. I gave him a copy of Signs. We sat for a few minutes, but I could see that he was in great discomfort. He apologized for his illness. We posed for the requisite proof-of-life shots and took our leave. It was a reminder of time and age and achievement and inevitable loss. The fact of the matter is that Sufi Abdullah had not been included in our original list of sages, primarily because we couldn't find a qualified writer to take on the biography. But when the pandemic swept across the subcontinent, one of our authors profiling another Pakistani sage suddenly had to withdraw from the project, and we were left, late in the day, without one of the 8 biographies. So I reached out to Sufi Sahib's grandson, Sufi Junaid Akhtar, who provided a detailed family history and referred me to an academic study of the Birmingham community and its spiritual source, the community of Zinda Pir, Sufi Sahib's master, in Ramkhul Sharif, Pakistan. So far, so good. But then I ran into what seemed like an insurmountable barrier. I discovered the family knew nothing about their patriarch's military career, which lasted from 1940, when he enlisted as a 17-year-old sepoy, to 1962, when he retired from the Army as a 39-year-old non-commissioned officer. This was far too long a period to ignore. The few fragments of information they passed on were either clearly wrong or hard to put into any kind of coherent narrative context. For example, the family insisted that Sufi Abdullah fought in Germany in 1940. That was obviously not true because nobody fought in Germany in 1940. So I looked in all the usual places: the Imperial War Museum, the archives of the British Indian Army, the Indian Office Library. Nothing. Whatever records there were in Britain dealt solely with British citizens, not with Indian soldiers. With a rising sense of frustration, I trawled through every online resource I could with absolutely no success. As a last resort, I reached out to someone I had met briefly in a gathering in Dubai several years before. General Yusuf Khan is a retired Pakistan Army officer. I doubted he would be willing or able to ferret out Abdullah Khan's military records, but I was desperate. I sent General Yusuf a message explaining my predicament and what I needed. He said that he would look into it, but it would take some time. It was like finding a needle in a haystack. I wasn't optimistic. The pandemic had pushed us many months behind our original schedule. Weeks passed and I heard nothing from General Yusuf. I began exploring the possibility of profiling a great South African sage whose grave I visited in Cape Town, but the family refused to cooperate. Another dead end. More weeks passed. Then, out of the blue, a message arrived, this time with attachments. File after file after file after file, the entire military career of Muhammad Abdullah Khan from beginning to end. It was, General Yusuf said, like finding a needle in a haystack. This was truly the key. Abdullah was deployed with the 4th Battalion of the 10th Baluch, and, as I suspected, he fought, was wounded, and captured in North Africa. It was during the infamous Battle of the Cauldron, where ill-prepared Allied infantry divisions faced General Erwin Rommel's unstoppable war machine. In the dead of night, Abdullah and his comrades in arms hurriedly dug shallow slit trenches in the exposed desert flatlands and hunkered down, rifles at ready, waiting for the counterattack. The night had been quiet, but by first light, German tank divisions engaged and decimated the Highlanders. From their trenches, Abdullah and his comrades could hear the boom of artillery echoing across the desert. Then silence. In the distance, a moving wall of dust appeared on the horizon, with an ascending mechanized roar as the unstoppable German war machine approached Baluch positions in the bleak morning light. As the sun rose from behind the sand dunes, the soldiers could see Afrika Korps panzers advancing. The panzers focused on gun emplacements. The young sepoys watched with rising terror as one gun position after another exploded. Gun teams stripped to the waist disappeared in fountains of sand and reappeared as dismembered corpses and convulsing wounded, shrieking in agony. One by one, 4/10 25-pounders were shelled and blown apart, leaving death, shrapnel, and carnage. The puny 2-pounder anti-tank guns and mortars were no match for the heavily armored panzers. The infantry fought heroically and furiously, but there was little they could do except to delay the inescapable arrival of a brutal and far superior force. Abdullah watched the shells from their rifles and Bren light machine guns ricochet from the ironclad tank armor. Blood and death were everywhere. Survivors bandaged the maimed and wounded. By forenoon, the 4/10 guns were dead. Nothing could stop the enemy tanks from moving around the trenches, pausing to spray the area with machine gun fire. Panzers were followed by lorries full of German troops, rapidly surrounding and overpowering the surviving infantry. In a last-stand resistance, Abdullah took a gunshot wound in the back of the upper left thigh. He was among the 25 officers and 519 sepoys from the 4/10 Baluch captured that day. German lorried infantry took charge and herded their captives toward Axis Divisional Headquarters. Officers and VCOs were separated from the other ranks. 19-year-old sepoy Abdullah Khan realized that he was now a prisoner of war, although he was far from understanding what that was to mean. As the sun went down, the POWs were lined up to be led off into internment. The darkness descended, a portent of the years of tribulation to come. Simply by knowing which regiment and battalion he served in made it possible to identify where he saw action, where he most likely was first interred as a POW, where he ended up in Germany, and how he escaped. I was now able to draw on other resources to construct his military narrative. General Yusuf's files opened up more than Sufi Abdullah's military career. For example, the family history has it that after the war, when Abdullah returned to his village unannounced in the dead of night, his father didn't recognize him. That struck me as odd and a little unbelievable until I read his enlistment papers. At the age of 17, his height was registered at 5 feet and 8 inches. He was a shorty. The hardened battle veteran that returned from war was well over 6 feet tall. It's no wonder his father didn't recognize his own son in the darkest part of the night. His military records also confirm Sufi Abdullah's sterling character. His commanding officers described him as extremely honest and hard-working, reliable and straightforward, cheerful under all circumstances, always well turned out, and possessed a pleasant personality. I wish we had more NCOs like him in this army. Sufi Abdullah was consistently, year on year, recommended for promotion to Jamidar, which would have made him an officer. Year on year he was passed over, and this was, General Yusuf explained, because the Pakistan Army continued a practice established by the British of promotion according to seniority rather than merit. There were too many others ahead of Abdullah. He decided to retire. Why was all this important to Sufi Abdullah's biography? It's important because his life in the military shaped his character, his sense of sacrifice, duty, service, his discipline and leadership qualities. He had faced death and deprivation, and he had survived. And in the military he met the man who would change his life, the hidden saint, Sayyid Hazrat Shah, who ran the tailoring unit for the 10th Baluch Regiment until his station was revealed. But this is a story for another day. May Allah bless Sufi Abdullah Khan Sahib and his master, and bless their communities and all those who love and follow the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa ala jami' ibadil mu'minin.